August 1980. Top-tier journalists from across the country converged on the city of South Bend, Indiana. They were chasing a headline that sounded like an administrative error or a work of fiction. 500 blue-collar factory workers had walked off the job and taken to the streets. They raised placards and banners, lit barricades on fire, and completely cordoned off the area. But that wasn't the real twist. The real twist was that they were striking against themselves. Outside the massive brick factory of South Bend Lathe Works, the actual owners of a multi-million-dollar manufacturing empire stood on the picket line. They shouted obscenities at the managers they technically hired. They boiled with rage over corporate policies legally enacted by their own company. Just 5 years prior, these lathe operators and machinists had made labor history. They successfully pulled off a miraculous $9.2 million leveraged buyout to purchase the company. Without a dime of personal capital, without the backing of any major corporate fund, driven purely by massive loans, political maneuvering, and a desperate will to survive. Staring down the barrel of imminent bankruptcy, they saved their own livelihoods. Overnight, they became the largest 100% worker-owned company in the United States. Across the nation, it was hailed as the dawn of a new era of capitalism. But this ownership carried a fatal structural contradiction. The workers held the stock certificates, but they didn't hold the steering wheel. The voting rights to choose the board of directors remained locked away in a blind trust controlled by the old, powerful management. The keys to ultimate power never left the corporate ivory tower. This created a bizarre psychological reality on the factory floor. The workers owned the brick, mortar, and iron of the facility, but they had absolutely no voice regarding their own future within those walls. The 1980 strike became a textbook definition of the industrial paradox. But to understand how this American dream strangled itself on Indiana soil, we must travel back a century earlier, across the Atlantic Ocean, to an older world built on muscle and cast iron. Part 1. The Twin Brothers and the Wall of Education. In 1870, in the rugged environment of County Cork, Ireland, identical twin brothers were born, John Joseph and Miles William O'Brien. Fortune was not on their side. Their mother passed away during childbirth. Their grief-stricken father packed up what little he owned and immigrated to Connecticut, USA, where the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The twins grew up surrounded by smoke, steam, and the clang of iron. As teenagers, both entered the world of machine tools. Working in legendary workshops like the Stanley Works, they mastered the magic of high-precision craftsmanship. One brother even secured a position in Thomas Edison's high-intensity research lab. They weren't just ordinary laborers, they were top-tier mechanics. By 1906, they spotted a massive flaw in American capitalism. Precision machining technology was a fortress reserved only for the wealthy. Back then, if anyone wanted to manufacture highly precise metal parts, they had to rely on massive, monolithic factories that housed prohibitively expensive machine tools. Small workshops, independent inventors, and rural repair shops simply couldn't compete. Ordering a custom part meant waiting weeks and paying exorbitant prices. The O'Brien brothers envisioned a different world. They wanted to build an engine lathe that was 1. Uncompromisingly precise, 2. Commercially affordable, 3. Compact enough to easily fit into any modest workshop. In 1906, armed with their meager savings and sharp intellect, they founded the South Bend Lathe Works in Indiana, renting a small, damp shop floor for just $65 a month. Yet the O'Brien brothers were more than just brilliant engineers. They were visionary marketing geniuses. They knew you couldn't sell a precision instrument to someone who didn't know how to operate it. So in 1907, they executed a masterstroke of corporate strategy. They published a simple, heavily illustrated instructional manual called How to Run a Lathe. What they did next was revolutionary. They distributed this book practically for free. For just a few cents, and often completely free, they shipped this book to vocational schools, high school shop classes, military academies, and apprenticeship programs. It created an incredible long-term customer acquisition loop. Step 1, a teenager in a trade school learns the fundamentals of geometry and metalworking on a South Bend lathe. Step 2, when that teenager grows up, enters the workforce, becomes a shop foreman, or starts their own business, they cannot imagine buying any brand other than South Bend. By 1929, the book had sold over 2.5 million copies, becoming the undisputed Bible of the machining world. The company was exporting machines in heavy wooden crates to 88 countries. Internationally, their telegraph address was a single telling word: twins. Their machines became the engine of innovation. From Henry Ford's experimental labs and the engineering halls of MIT to Thomas Edison's private research facilities, their lathes were omnipresent. They were even packed onto ships heading into the freezing depths of Arctic expeditions. South Bend was no longer just a manufacturer, it was the global standard of American manufacturing. Then, without warning, the ground collapsed beneath them. Late 1929 brought the devastating crash of the Great Depression. Worldwide industrial orders plummeted to near zero. Facing ruin, the O'Brien brothers pivoted rapidly. In 1934, at the absolute nadir of the economic crisis, they launched a stripped-down, beautifully engineered 9-inch workshop lathe. Its price tag? Just $75. The price was so low that an unemployed mechanic could buy one, set it up in his garage, and earn enough to put food on the table. The marketing campaign carried a powerful populist message: buy this machine, be your own boss, and start your own business. While competitors cut costs by manufacturing cheap, inferior goods, South Bend refused to compromise an inch on their trademark precision. Then came World War II, completely rewriting the playbook. By government decree, all civilian production ceased. The U.S. military took total control of South Bend's assembly lines. The twins' machines were deployed to the front lines. In naval warfare, these lathes were bolted directly into the hulls of warships and destroyers. If a propeller shaft or valve blew out mid-ocean, Samers machined a replacement part on the spot. On land campaigns, these lathes were mounted to the backs of mobile trucks, tracking behind General Patton's tank divisions through the mud of Europe to repair heavy artillery and heavy weaponry on the battlefield. For their relentless, flawless production, the company was awarded the U.S. military's prestigious Army-Navy E Award. However, the architects of this empire did not live to see the ultimate realization of their success. Miles O'Brien passed away in 1936, and John O'Brien died in 1946, just as the post-war economic boom was taking off. In 1959, lacking succession within the O'Brien family, the company was sold to Amstead Industries, a massive diversified conglomerate. That sale marked the beginning of a slow, painful decline. By the 1970s, the American Midwest was hit by a tidal wave of foreign competition. Cheap, high-speed lathes from Japan and Taiwan, equipped with computer numerical control technology, flooded the American market. Meanwhile, South Bend remained stubborn, stuck in its legacy manual analog technology. They fell decades behind. Staring at deep financial losses, Amstead Industries decided to wash its hands of the business. In 1975, they announced plans to shut down and liquidate the factory. It meant the overnight termination of 500 highly skilled middle-class workers. At this critical juncture, a radical economist named Louis Kelso entered the picture. Kelso proposed a profound philosophical solution. What if you could permanently resolve the eternal conflict between labor and capital? You do it by making the workers the owners of the machines, the capital they operate. Thus, he invented the employee stock ownership plan. Desperate to save their jobs and their local economy, union leaders, local politicians, and government agencies came together in 1975 to forge a historic, highly complex deal. Combining federal grants, city development funds, and private bank credits, they cobbled together a $9.2 million financing package. Suddenly, the tables turned. The keys to the factory floor were handed over to the workers. Men in grease-stained aprons overnight became corporate shareholders. Initially, the experiment looked like a capitalist miracle. Productivity skyrocketed because workers knew that every part they machined directly boosted their own stock value. Profits reached record highs. By 1979, sales had nearly doubled. Washington politicians staged press conferences on the Indiana factory floor, triumphantly declaring South Bend the future of American capitalism. But hidden beneath the celebrations and upward trending charts, a catastrophic time bomb was ticking. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.